Welcome to our November webinar for iNACOL. If I could ask everybody here just to take a quick moment, and on the left-hand side of the whiteboard there you'll see a little star. If you click on that star, if you could click on that star and click on where you are in the United States, then that'll give us an indication. Secondly, if you wouldn't mind also typing into the chat room what John asked, which was to type a little bit about your background and where you're from. So we're doing two things at once. We're all multitaskers, right? Great. So I see we've got people from Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, Colorado, and then I'm in California. So let's see. I see we've got Steve from the Wisconsin Department of Public Education. Could we get some of the rest of you to type in a little bit about yourself? Thank you. I can see by the icons there people are typing things in. So we've got, let's see, we've got Rebecca from the Jenison International Academy in Michigan, great. And Tracy from the Illinois Math and Science Academy, great. And Anne-Marie's in Ohio, awesome. All right, well, welcome everybody. Just want to move this right along because you don't want to hear my voice the whole time. So I'm happy to introduce to you two people I've known for many years, Amy Murin and John Watson. They are the originators of the Keeping Pace report, and we're so excited that we continue to have an ongoing partnership with them through iNACOL and through their group, the Evergreen Education Group. And they've got lots to share about their latest findings with keeping pace with K12 online and blended learning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy and John.
Rob, thank you so much. We appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I was going to say this morning, I realized that it just clicked past noon here in Colorado where I am. Rob, given that it's a fairly small group today, I'm going to encourage that we get any questions via the chat window. If anybody would like to raise a hand and raise any questions via audio as well, we are open to any of those. Rob, if there's any other method of interaction you would like to suggest from the audience, please either just jump in and let me know that you want to say something or type something in the chat window. I'll also ask both you, Rob, and Amy to keep an eye on the chat window and let me know if any questions are coming up that I am missing as I'm talking. I'm just going to be talking here for a couple of minutes and then turn it over to Amy. As Rob mentioned, Amy and I are with the Evergreen Education Group. We are a small consulting organization based in Colorado. We work with districts and consortia and state education agencies and others who are implementing or growing online and blended programs. We also do a fair bit of research, including the Keeping Pace report. The Keeping Pace report is now just entering its 10th year. The edition that we'll be talking about today is the 9th annual edition, and so we are now getting started on the 10th one, which will come out next year. And I think it's valuable to think about where we came from and why Keeping Pace got started in the early 2000s. Back then, there was a recognition that education policy was not keeping up very well with education practice. And we had an event right before the Virtual School Symposium, which was where this year's Keeping Pace report was released. We had an event just before VSS this year that was a worthwhile reminder that policy still has some challenges in keeping up with what's happening on the ground in practice. Some of you may have heard of Coursera, which is one of the organizations offering online courses at the post-secondary level. There are Coursera and other organizations that are offering MOOCs, which are massively open online courses. They offer them for free, and they typically offer them at least a basic version without any diploma or degree or certification that comes along with them, at least the free version, but they are available for free. They're online, and they're offered by some of the leading colleges and universities. Well, Coursera's been around for a little while. There are a few of these organizations. And right before VSS, we found out that Minnesota, in its infinite wisdom, decided that Coursera's courses would not be allowed in the great state of Minnesota. They said, no, you cannot take a Coursera course if you are a Minnesota resident, ignoring the fact that the courses are free and they don't actually have any diploma or degree attached to them. It was a bit of an amusing 24 hours, and the state realized fairly quickly that what it was doing really didn't make a whole lot of sense. And after 24 or 48 hours, rescinded that order and said, yes, in fact, you can take free online courses if you're a Minnesota resident. Within that day or two, Coursera posted something on its website that essentially said, if you're taking a course, please certify that you're not a Minnesota resident. If you happen to be a Minnesota resident, please go get yourself outside of the state lines before you take our course. That didn't make a whole lot of sense. That's a bit of an extreme example. But what we find is that there are still many, many instances where education policy is not keeping up with the practice of what's happening in the online and blended world. These days, Keeping Pace continues to track some of those examples, provide some of the examples of what states are doing well, and is increasingly looking at issues of practice also. One of the key things that we look at in our research, one of the key things that drives us and NACOL, and I think quite a few of you as well, is the fact that we know that although online and blended learning have grown very quickly in recent years, going back now more than 10 years really, we're still at a stage where most options are not yet available to all students. And I see a question from Anne Marie. What reason did Minnesota give for the original stance? It's a great question, and thank you for that. The reason was that there was a law or regulation on the books, essentially, that said that post-secondary providers have to be licensed by the state in order to operate in the state. And this is a really good example of a situation where the folks who temporarily said you can't take Coursera courses were in fact simply responding to the letter of the law. It creates a real challenge in the sense that we have worked with some of these people in different institutions where they may recognize that a law doesn't really make sense, but it's not necessarily their role. In fact, it's not at all their role to interpret those laws. When they say some things that are fairly clear, they have to go through different channels to make those changes. So in that case, it was an initial interpretation that a law that said post-secondary providers had to be licensed by the state before the courses could be offered. That was reinterpreted a bit later. But this issue of policies being a bit outdated, we see it happen again and again. And I'll give you one other example, a completely different example that goes back several years. And Steve Sanders from the Wisconsin DPI will recognize the example that I'm about to give. And Steve, if you want to add anything to what I'm about to say, please do. Several years ago, there was a lawsuit in Wisconsin that challenged the legality of the online schools that were operating there. And the lawsuit was based on the role of the teacher and the role of the parent, and whether parents were acting as teachers. And I won't go into much more detail about it, except to say one of the first rulings coming out of that lawsuit, in that ruling, the judge agreed with the plaintiffs. And in that ruling, he essentially said, I'm not ruling on whether these online schools are a good thing or a bad thing. We're hearing lots of stories about how they are helping students. But the fact is that these schools are violating this part of the law. Now, in that That particular case has a happy ending if you're a proponent of online schools or a student who is attending one of those online schools, because the Wisconsin legislature changed the law to allow those schools to continue to exist and, in fact, to grow over time. But that is an example where as you all know, the role of somebody in a state agency and a judge as well is to interpret the laws as they are written, and sometimes that runs into problems, as we've seen in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and plenty of other states as well. Going back to the slide that I have on the screen, and Anne-Marie, thank you for that question, and I encourage other questions and comments as well. Despite the fact that we've seen a proliferation of opportunities, we're still in a situation where in most states, most options are not available to many students. This particular graphic that I have on the screen right now comes from the current Keeping Pace report. It comes from a table that is on page 14 of the report, and it looks at, for each state, are supplemental and full-time options available to students across all grade levels. This year, for the first time, we're able to point to Florida as the first state that has filled in these circles and is providing all of these opportunities. Now, we are still waiting to see how this is actually going to play out in practice, but we know that Florida is far and away in a better situation than most other states. Most other states are more similar to Connecticut and Colorado, which we have on this graph. Now, not to poke at Connecticut and Colorado, they are fairly normal, in fact. Connecticut with very few options for students across the state. Colorado, which has fully online schools, has options for students who want to attend a full-time school, but not that many supplemental options, and for students who are outside the Front Range urban areas, not a tremendous number of blended opportunities as well. These types of issues, the policy issues that haven't kept up with what's happening on the ground, the lack of opportunities for students, and a third one that we'll talk about a bit later in the discussion about quality and accountability. These are the types of things that we highlight in the Keeping Pace report. If you're not familiar with Keeping Pace, I'll mention a couple of things before we move on. First, the report is freely available at kpk12.com. I'll ask Amy to type that into the chat window so that you all have it. The report is freely available. If you were lucky enough to attend the Virtual School Symposium, you should have received a copy. If you weren't lucky enough to attend that, you can download the copy at kpk12.com. Also, many of the graphics that we're going to show you today are available for download individually as well. The report is Creative Commons licensed, which means that you are free to use it. Keeping Pace is free and available because of the many sponsors that we have that include iNACOL, thank you, Rob, and include a wide variety of other educational organizations, public, private, for-profit, and nonprofit. State education agencies in Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Virtual School has been a sponsor in the past. We have county offices of education in California, the Florida Virtual School, Michigan Virtual School, which are state virtual schools, companies like Blackboard, and then for-profit providers and EMOs such as Connections Education, Advanced Academics, Plato, and others. So it's that wide range of sponsors that contributes both to the quality and the availability of the report. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the categories that we see. We're going to talk somewhat about what the landscape looks like in terms of single district programs, state virtual schools, multi-district online schools, consortium programs, and others. Before we get into some of those specific areas, I want to talk a little bit about blended learning. As many of you, I'm sure, recognize, blended learning is in many ways the buzzword. In many ways, it's the next generation, the next iteration of online learning. We think quite a bit about blended learning in the report, and we really build on the work that Innosight has done. Innosight defines blended learning as an education program in which a student learns at least in part with some control over time, place, path, and or pace, and at least in part at a supervised brick-and-mortar location away from home. That student control is critical, because what we're looking for in that definition is attempting to define out instances which are simply a layering of a new type of educational technology on an existing classroom. Simply adding whiteboards or simply adding iPads or laptops or any other devices does not mean it's blended learning. You can do many of the same things that you've always done in a classroom through a different technology. And while those things may have real value, we don't count them as blended learning because we're concerned that there are too many instances like that that are not transformative. We think about blended learning in a slightly different way than Innosight, really building on their definition in these three parts. A blended course or program has a meaningful online component, a significant supervised on-site component, and data that allows for personalized instruction. That data capture is really critical. It's allowing for that personalized instruction. It's allowing for students to move through at their own pace. Now, I want to stress that while I'm presenting that last slide in terms of an equal pie chart, these don't have to be equal thirds. You could have the online component being a larger part. You could have the on-site component being a larger part as well. So there are these different components, and any one of them can be the most important one. You have these different models as well, and this figure comes from Innosight also, talking about the rotation model, flex model, self-blend, etc. But one of the key things that we think about, and we talk about quite a bit in our work with practitioners who are implementing programs, is that the model isn't the starting point. And we hear this quite a bit, so we really like to stress this point. We hear quite a bit, we're starting a blended program, which of those models should we use? It's not the right starting point. The starting point is, what are you trying to accomplish? What's your educational goal? Who are the intended student groups? And what are the capabilities and desires of your district within this program? We see all different types of programs. Riverside running a combination of fully online and supplemental and blended. An extensive e-academy in Albuquerque. Voice in Chicago running an extensive blended program. Rocket Ship and Carpe Diem, which many of you have probably heard about as charter schools that started in California and Arizona respectively and now are moving into new states in the Midwest. All of these represent different types of models and different specifics in what they're providing. Each of them are equally valuable. We are not at all at the point where the starting point should be what's the model, but it should be what are we trying to accomplish. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Amy Murrin to talk about the second of our categories, state virtual schools, and walk through some of the other numbers that we have on state virtual schools.
Great, thanks John.
Amy,
thanks Rob for having us here today. I'm going to talk to you about three different categories of programs that we address in Keeping Pace 2012. There are a couple of other categories, including consortia and post-secondary programs, that we're not going to talk about in the presentation today, but you can find a little more information in the report if you're interested in learning more about those areas. But first, let's dig into state virtual schools. This is a very complicated graphic, so I'll talk you through this a little bit. There are two different primary data points on this graphic. The first is a snapshot of enrollment count of state virtual schools. And you can see from the color that the larger state virtual schools have a darker color. The South is well represented. Florida had over 300,000 course enrollments in school year 2011 and 12, and so is by far the largest state virtual school in the country. We define a course enrollment as one student enrolled in one semester-long online course. And in general, state virtual schools tend to serve high school students, also reaching down and offering high school courses to middle school students. But in general, most of the state virtual schools focus on grades 9 through 12. On the right side of the graphic, you'll see the gray bars that represent the ratio to state population. This is meant to give you a sense beyond how many enrollments are being served as to what percentage of the state population those enrollments represent. So Florida still represents very well because they're serving so many course enrollments. But New Hampshire, which had about 15,000 course enrollments in school year 2011 and 12 at its state virtual school, is serving a larger percentage of the state population than you might expect because it's simply a smaller state high school population. So you can see that there are some schools. North Carolina is another one that has a large number of course enrollments and is serving a large percentage of the state population. Georgia does fairly well. But then there are a lot of schools down there serving just between, what is our bottom number is 769 with Vermont, and serving just a handful of course enrollments across the state and not serving very many students. There were 620,000 course enrollments served in school year. In fact, actually, I'm realizing, John, I just went to flip slides and realized I can't flip slides. I'm not a moderator. So, John, can you have me? Thank you very much. Perfect. State virtual schools served 620,000 course enrollments in school year 2011 and 12, which was a 16% increase over the previous year. It was 19% in the year before that. So Florida virtual school is still about 50% of the state virtual school enrollments across the country. We're seeing state virtual schools continue to bifurcate into two different groups, and this is a trend we identified in Keeping Pace 2011 that we saw continue this year. There are the state virtual schools that are well supported and serving a large number of course enrollments and have either funding support from the state legislature, whether via appropriation, or in Florida where funding follows the student. And so we're seeing those state virtual schools continue to grow and continue to serve more and more students. On the bottom of this slide, you'll see a handful of state virtual schools that are not well supported and so are either shrinking or staying at about the same number of course enrollments. Kentucky Virtual Schools in the bottom line of that table was actually shut down at the end of school year 2011 and 12 and is now a state-led initiative. And they still receive a small amount of funding and are guiding students toward existing online programs throughout the state, but they are no longer serving as a state virtual school. There are 27 state virtual schools operating in the country right now. Kentucky closed this past year, and Tennessee, the E4TN state virtual school, closed last year. Let's now talk about states with multi-district fully online schools. In most states, these are virtual charter schools. However, we're seeing more and more districts open fully online schools that they are able to make available to students statewide. Colorado is a great example of a state that has 25 multi-district schools, many of which are operated by districts and are serving students statewide. There are about 275,000 students enrolled in fully online schools. When we talk about the state virtual schools, we talked about course enrollment. When we talk about the fully online schools, we're talking about full-time online students. So those are 275,000 students across the country that are fully online. Fully online schools are operating in 31 states. Ohio and Pennsylvania have by far the largest number of fully online students. You'll see Arizona has a large bubble over there. However, that is an estimate because Arizona was not able to come up with a number prior to our go-to-print date, although we expect to have a number from them in the next few weeks as their state reporting is due to the legislature right about now, in fact, I believe tomorrow. But Arizona also looks at a unique count of any student in the state taking either a fully online program or any supplemental online course. And so that's not necessarily 39,000 fully online students. So Ohio and Pennsylvania are really the largest, represent the largest number of fully online students across the country. We're seeing that fully online schools are growing at an average of about 15% annually. You'll see in this table, which is also available in the report, that in states where fully online schools are well established, numbers continue to grow at about 15%. There's a little bit of a range there, 10 to 23 in the table. 30 states are represented, and it's an even broader range. But when states have made this option available to students for a number of years, then they tend to see their enrollments grow by about 15% each year. However, in states that have recently lifted caps, such as in Michigan and Indiana, or states that have recently added a fully online option, such as Tennessee, we're seeing those numbers grow quickly. In Indiana, the caps were lifted and enrollment jumped from 470 online students to 3,733 in just 1 year. And that's a relatively small state, and so we're seeing that population jump almost 700% is significant. We expect those numbers to continue to grow in Indiana. They have seen a rise in the number of district programs. They're the first public school district opened its fully online school last year, and we're seeing more district programs opening up. As those caps have lifted and more options have become available, students have been jumping on them. Last but not least, let's talk about our single district programs. This is not a pretty graphic because the fact of the matter is this is the hardest category of online programs to put our arms around. There is no state level, there's no federal reporting for fully online students or especially for supplemental online courses. Some states do have state level reporting for single district programs, but that's pretty unusual. When we talk about single district programs, we're specifically referencing the programs that are just serving students within their districts. And so regardless of the delivery method, the state level reporting does not necessarily specify the delivery method. And so if a class is delivered online but is all delivered by district teachers to district students, then the district doesn't have to report that to the state. However, there are a few reports that have come out in the last year that are starting to give us a sense for what options are available to students and how many students are participating. NCES released a report about a year ago that surveyed over 2,000 districts across the country and identified that about 5% of the total K12 student population in the U.S. is participating in distance learning. It also found that about 50% of districts across the country have some students participating in online learning. However, the key here is that online learning option might simply be a very small credit recovery program available to a handful of students, or a handful of students taking advantage of online AP classes. And so even though 50% of districts have some students participating, the percentage of students participating is still quite small. We saw those results replicated in reports in the census that was distributed by CLearn in California, the California Learning Resource Network, as well as in Southern Region Educational Board states with a census this summer. And our group, Evergreen, surveyed rural school districts in Colorado this summer and found very similar numbers. And so we believe this number. However, the fact of the matter is this is an estimate. Let's dig in and talk just a little bit about some of the policy issues that are identified in Keeping Pace 2012 and talk about some of the themes that we saw. First, we saw a number of states have student choice laws. These are laws in Florida, Utah, Minnesota, and Arizona are giving students more options for online courses. They're giving students the ability to choose from multiple providers. Funding follows the students in those 4 states, and it allows students typically to choose from multiple providers while staying enrolled as a student within their district. However, some of this legislation, and John referenced this earlier when speaking about Coursera, that the policy isn't necessarily implemented the way that it was intended. Oklahoma passed a law last year and says that school districts shall not deny students the opportunity to enroll in educationally appropriate courses. Sounds great, but the fact of the matter is it's unclear who is responsible for the implementation of this legislation. Is it the school district? Is it the State Board of Ed, the State Department of Education, or is it the legislature? We have not seen a corresponding jump in enrollment as a result of this legislation, likely because of its confusion with its implementation. Steve, I'm seeing your comment jumping back and talking about district level enrollments. This is great to know that in Wisconsin we should have a better idea of online courses as we've implemented a coursework completion data collection flag. That's terrific, and we are starting to see more states add that flag to their state level reporting so that they can identify students enrolled in online courses. You know, Florida has implemented that in the last year. Colorado is looking at implementing it for the next year, and so we'll start to see that improve, that reporting improve. Digging back into policy, military recruitment. Historically, the military looks at graduates of online schools in what they call the Tier 2 status, which was, it made it harder for students to be recruited into different branches of the military, and in addition to making it harder, they accepted fewer Tier 2 graduates into the different branches of the military. In June 2012, the National Defense Authorization Act improved the state for these online students, although it hasn't corrected it to the point that we're completely satisfied just yet. It now says that non-traditional students, including our fully online students, can be given Tier 1 recruiting status, which is the status the military gives to traditional brick-and-mortar graduates. However, if those Tier 1 non-traditional students must score higher than traditional students on the Armed Forces Qualification Test. So we've made some progress, but the INACOL Advocacy Committee and other folks around the country are working to make sure that graduates from fully online programs be given the same status as graduates from brick-and-mortar programs. NCAA eligibility has changed very dramatically this year, and this kicked in for 9th graders in this school year. So NCAA eligibility has changed for these students entering 9th grade now, so we likely won't see the ramifications until those students enter college in 4 years. But the NCAA has launched a publicity blitz to educate 9th graders because the changes don't just affect things like GPA, but also impact the progression of courses that students must take as they go through high school, as well as the number of core courses taken in certain years of high school. So it's a pretty significant change in addition to just increased standards. These standards don't just apply to online courses, but we included this in Keeping Pace this year because of the important note that the NCAA requires that all courses must be teacher-led and include significant teacher interaction. There was a fuss about this a couple of years ago when BYU found that when the NCAA determined that BYU online courses were not eligible, did not meet NCAA eligibility requirements. And so that is what at least brought it to our attention, and in recent years those eligibility requirements have been clarified, and more programs are making sure that whether or not their classes meet NCAA eligibility is noted clearly on their websites. And last but not least, let's talk about the Cod Research Database that just launched in the last few weeks. This database, which is the URL is on your screen there, built from a database started by the University of Florida's Virtual School Clearinghouse. And so the database already has hundreds of citations in it that are specific to K12 online and blended learning. You can add to this database from that website, and the database will continue to grow, and is meant to be a resource for everyone working in K12 online and blended learning, looking for specifics, whether it's about special education needs, early education students, or simply looking at quality implementation. It's great to see this research now available all in one place, because as our field continues to grow, we need to be pointing to best practices and good examples of what is happening in the field. And then continuing the discussion on quality, I'm going to hand back over to John and let him talk to you about building quality online programs.
And before we even get to that, this research database I think is particularly notable as it is also related to a whole project that INACOL has taken on recently about quality and accountability. Rob, I don't know if you have the exact title and perhaps URL of that, the new quality report, but it's getting at this issue of there's been so many questions about, does online learning work? And the answer to that question is really, it can work, it doesn't have to work. It's all about how good the implementation is. As we move on to the question of, can we know whether an individual online school, how well it is doing, what we're seeing is that in quite a number of states, that's actually a remarkably difficult question to answer, because there are relatively few states that are able to really report on a robust view of student outcomes that are based on more than proficiency measures. The report that INACOL put out that Rob just referenced in the chat room talks about and makes a recommendation about looking at multiple measures of student outcomes based on proficiency, student growth, graduation rates, college and career readiness, and closing the achievement gap. And one of the particulars about that as well is the idea that these measures be based on actual students and not based on cohorts of students, as in quite a few cases, things like graduation rates from high school and student growth are based on. We're at a point where there is, in so many other fields, we see incredible uses of big data, the ways that all sorts of companies and other institutions know so much about us as individual consumers. And we haven't yet gotten to the point where we have that same level of retrievable data and knowledge about students such that we can really make those assessments. Now, I was involved in a number of conversations on these topics, and one of the typical exchanges was around an online school provider saying something like, we're getting students in who are well below grade level, we're getting students in who are nominally high school seniors, but they are at least 3 years away from graduating from high school. And when the online practitioners said that, the folks in the room from districts would typically say, welcome to our world, as in we deal with that all the time. And my view on that is, well, that's true, but that's not an excuse. That is something that we have to all be pushing to get better data and be better able to truly assess what's happening with online schools and individual online courses for a few reasons. One reason is, as Amy referenced and as Steve Sanders touched on in the chat window, while the data are getting better, they're still not all that good in most states. We don't yet have a really good picture about what's going on. Secondly, we have a handful of states that are already moving towards students being able to choose individual online courses. And my fear is that in several of those states, at least, we are a ways from being able to actually report on those results. This ultimately leads to a concern that the implementations won't be all that good, and we'll be in a situation where everyone from individual practitioners to school administrators to policymakers will, in perhaps 3 years, saying, online and blended learning, we tried that, it didn't work. It's not an outcome that we want, and it's an outcome that we risk, or at the very least we risk an outcome where we're seeing online and blended learning become ubiquitous but not transformative. To try to address that concern in another way, one of the things that the Keeping Pace team and sponsors have done over the last couple of years is put together a section that's called Planning for Quality. This section is a roadmap for some of the issues that practitioners should be thinking about as they are either planning, implementing, or growing an online or blended program. This has been a collaborative project going back, as I said, a couple of years. We first published a version of this in 2011 and upgraded it in 2012, and it comes out of some work that we've done with districts and county offices of education in California. So we are seeing it being used a fair bit in California and in a few other states as well. The framework that we developed in California and applied in Keeping Pace looks at what we call 4 focus areas of content, teaching, technology, and operations, and really pushes the idea that as a practitioner, you should be thinking about planning for all these things. What we see quite often is a starting point that is often based on content or technology without bringing in all the different elements of teaching and operations, and also perhaps not thinking through the content issues as deeply as they should be thought through. We take each of these 4 focus areas and apply a series of questions. First, a general set of questions. It gets back to some of the educational goals that we referenced in the conversation earlier. Things like, what grade levels are being served? Is the program going to be supplemental, full-time, blended learning, or all of the above? Is the program going to be self-paced? Students work through at their own pace, or is it going to be based on cohorts? Will courses be open entry and open exit, or will they be working on a traditional school calendar? What will the role of the teacher be? All of these are key questions that we believe should be addressed very early in the process, because what we sometimes see happening in the programs that we have researched is that a school chooses a provider, a content provider, a learning management system, or perhaps they go and get a bunch of devices, and then they're left wondering, okay, what do we do now? What's next? And really, what's next is going back to these questions that ideally should have been answered previously. We present this series of questions for each of those 4 focus areas, and then for the first time in this year's report, we put together 3 example timelines. By the way, if you have the report or when you download it, all this starts on page 44, and we are making it available as a separate download of just this section as well. The 3 example timelines work from 3 different scenarios. Starting at the top here, an 18-month timeline where we envision a district that has decided to develop its own courses and use its own teachers. A 12-month timeline when a district is using provider-supplied courses but is using its own teachers. And a 9-month timeline where the district is using provider-supplied courses and teaching. By the way, I'm using the word district here somewhat loosely. We're really thinking about whatever level of entity is implementing the program. In many instances, those are districts. In some cases, like here in my home state of Colorado, there are BOCES, there are county offices, there are other alliances and consortia that we see doing this as well. But the key point here is that putting together a high-quality program from which you expect good student outcomes takes time. And it takes even more time if you expect that entity to be building its own courses and providing its own teachers. Now, to be clear, we're not at all suggesting that that's the preferred path. We're agnostic on the path. But we see quite a few programs getting started and thinking, we want to use all our own resources, and we think we can do this in 6 months. Our answer to that is, on that timeline, with those resources, you are highly likely to fail and wonder why blended learning didn't work so well. In the timelines, we put together specific decision points, tasks, and other deliverables and milestones. Things like, and by the way, this page and the next couple of slides that I'm going to show you are simply snapshots. I'm not trying to walk you through the entire thing, but just give you a few snapshots of what this might look like. In this case, and in fact all three of the timelines, we start with this 3-month strategic planning process to think about the needs analysis and some of those questions that I talked about earlier. But then you get into these issues of facilities and course development support, professional development for teachers, and each of those different areas. Again, just providing some of these examples. As you think about these 4 focus areas, content, teaching, technology, and operations, many of these have prerequisite issues. What I mean by that is, if, for instance, you believe that you're going to have your teachers developing their own courses, then you have to have teachers having engaged in some level of professional development before they do that. So if you think that a course development process itself should perhaps take 3 months, then the first thing you have to do is add several months worth of professional development time ahead of that. We put these timelines specifically on with very specific months in mind, working towards a specific starting date, which we consider to be the fall semester of a new school year. Of course, that can change, and of course, for much of this, as they say when you buy a new car, your mileage may vary. There are different approaches to these types of things, and there's certainly a lot of flexibility in this. But we put in specific months because one of the things that becomes immediately clear to anybody who is working in an existing school on something that approaches a traditional timeline or a traditional calendar is that the kind of progress that you can make in a month like May or June or September typically is not the same as what you might be able to do in October or February. There are, when you're at the beginning or the end of the year, things tend to slow down. In the summer, depending on what the expectations are, it can be a time of really accelerating new program development, or it may be a time when relatively few teachers and administrators are even available. So you run into that issue of having to take into account those exact times, those exact months is, we believe, critically important as well. Rob, that ends our presentation. I'm going to turn it over to you to see if you have any questions. I'll see if Amy wants to add anything, and I'm more than glad to take questions via chat or audio, or Rob, however you would like to handle them. Rob, we appreciate the opportunity to present to the group today, appreciate our work with iNACOL and all the work that your organization is doing in so many different ways. So thank you for all of that.
So since we have a few minutes left, I'm going to just jump in here because there are a couple things. I read your report and, am I not on? Yeah, I am. Okay. So the one slide that you showed, in fact, I'm going to back up to it since I have some of that power here. The percentages were really interesting to me because one of the things I think in your executive summary you talked about was something like less than 6% of the overall population across the nation is really in an online course. And where is that slide that I wanted to look at here? Is this it? Let's see. Nope, that was not it. Anyway, can you talk a little bit about the... Yeah, go ahead. Can you just talk a little bit about the percentages overall and the people that you're counting when you talk about the overall population? Are those students in public schools or students in all schools, and where are those numbers coming from?
That's a great question. John, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. And Rob, is this the slide that you had in mind?
You just chatted yes.
Yeah, go ahead. There's only 2 speakers, so go for it.
The percentages come from a few different sources. Let me start with this slide. It's an important slide, and it's one of the places where we, as you see in that rightmost column, we show the percentage of state students in full-time online schools. And as you noted, Rob, our overall estimate is somewhere in the 5% range, and these numbers are quite a bit lower. A couple of things to say about this. What we're seeing is that there are no states in which those fully online schools are accounting for more than about 2%, certainly no more than somewhere in the range of 2 to 3% of all students. I think this suggests a couple of things. One, it suggests that online schools, fully online schools, we're talking about a situation where this is the only school that the student is attending, probably has a natural cap in terms of how many students want to go to that type of school. For the vast majority of students, going to school still means going to a physical building. And there's a number of reasons built into that. Parents are maybe working and they can't be at home with young students. Parents or students themselves want to go to school because they like that social interaction with other students. They may feel that they're not going to have the same extracurricular options in an online school, although I should say that online schools by and large do a fairly good job of addressing extracurricular activities, but there is still the perception among students and families about that as well. So these numbers we're seeing remaining quite low. I think it's an important point because we've seen people in states that don't yet have fully online schools worried that students will all choose these types of schools and that essentially there'll be the end of physical brick and mortar schools. We haven't seen that at all, and I don't think that's going to happen. The difference between this number and that 5% estimate is within all the different supplemental programs that are primarily at the district level. Now, in that section of the report where we put out that estimate, we really tried to be quite clear about the fact that it is an estimate, that, as we like to say internally, we don't know and nobody else does either. And the reason we put it that way is because we have sure seen some numbers being tossed around that when you dig a little bit deeper, what you find is they're either based on very small sample sizes and huge extrapolations that have huge margins of error, or you see reports that aren't quoting their sources at all. And so our estimate of several million students, or about 5% of the population, comes from triangulating from a bunch of different sources. But again, large majority of those students are the ones who are perhaps taking one online course. They might be taking it from a state virtual school. They might be taking it from a provider like an Odyssey-ware or an E2020 or a variety like that. And those are the ones who are being counted there.
So when you're figuring out that percent, I just want to clarify, you're using the state number of students in public schools. Is that correct? The one that the states collect?
That's exactly right. We are using typically NCES numbers that are for public schools. Now, the percentages of private, so you can look at private school students and homeschool students as well. Those are fairly low percentages in most places, with just a couple of exceptions, such that you're not going to see these percentages change materially if you were to include the homeschool students and private school students in that bottom line number.
Great. That's what I thought. I was having a conversation earlier this week with somebody in a private school, and we were talking about the keeping pace percentages, and so you helped validate that. So there's a question in the chat room about schools purchasing versus creating curriculum. So maybe, all right, so let me throw two questions out to both of you. One, it would be interesting after you answer that question in the chat room for you to think 5 years out based on your experiences and all the stuff you guys collect, on what percentage at that point do you think public school students will be taking an online course, at least one? And then two, do you see this, is there a trend towards purchasing or creating curriculum?
I'll take that second question about curriculum, and I'll punt the hard question about your 5-year prediction over to Amy to give her some time to think about that. And because I jumped in, I can take the easy question and kick the hard one over to Amy. So the question about trends of purchasing versus creating curriculum when building out an online program. We are seeing, I would say, there's not a clear trend. In past years, we asked this question of programs that we surveyed in Keeping Pace, and what we found was everything across the board, from programs that were licensing 100% to building their own 100%. What I would say at this point, if there is a trend, it is towards doing a mix of both. There are relatively few programs, I would argue, that are completely developing their own. In part because what we're seeing now is there are more resources that districts can tap into. And so a district may say, well, we want to develop our own courses. If they're being smart about it, that probably includes bringing in some resources from outside sources. For the simple reason that I have yet to find a district that can do a really good job. I shouldn't say that. There are a couple. The average district is not going to be able to expensively invest in teachers recording animations or short little videos or anything like that and updating them and keeping them current at the same level where they can go acquire some of those assets at relatively low prices. So even these cases where we see districts building their own, and we do see a fair bit of that, in a lot of cases they're bringing in some elements of the course. So I would say, so where I at the start of this question said we don't really see a trend, I'm gonna reverse myself and say the trend is to get away from either 100% building or 100% buying, but doing a mix, where sometimes that mix is within each individual course that has a mix of built and acquired content, and other cases where a district may be using some acquired courses and some courses that it is creating on its own. Amy, I'll go over to you now to give you the prediction question.
I was just going to say I love it when I agree with you, because I would absolutely agree that what we're starting to see is a mix. It's a nice job on that one. I'll say a couple of quick things since we have 1 minute to go to wrap up. Dawson survey research found that about 6 million students, or a third of post-secondary students, were enrolled in at least one online course, and that was in 2010. So if we're looking at the progression of education, and K12 has been perhaps a few years behind post-secondary in terms of its movement toward online learning, then my guess is that they're leading the way for us. I also firmly believe that just in the way that we're starting to see more and more districts move to a blend of building and buying online curriculum, we're looking to a blend in the classroom where there will no longer be clear delineations between what is happening online and what's happening in the classroom. It's just going to be learning. And so I suspect that there will be more and more blended learning happening. I don't know how much more our online numbers will grow, but I think our blended learning numbers will continue to grow exponentially. And Rob, I think that's good for me. Shall I hand off to you to close up? I don't see any of the questions in the chat window.
Anybody else? Any quick burning final questions from you? 40%. Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here today. It's been a fun conversation with John and Amy, who live this every day. We thank them for all their work they've done and helped to set a framework for the rest of us to implement this stuff, because it's always hard being in the trenches and taking the 1,000-foot view like you guys do so well. So thanks again, everybody. And if you're not a member of INACOL, I'd encourage you to do so. And then secondly, we have another webinar tomorrow if you'd like to come to that one. And then we've got a December webinar talking about quality and accreditation, which you can find on our website. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Amy and John, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Rob.